my grandfather's ideology was that he was building the army of God. And he believed that God called him to be the next prophet, kind of like Muhammad or Elijah.
How do you explain that you found a way to start to question what was being written on the slate of who you are? What was your reference point, and how did you start to question? Thanks for listening to the Dr. Phil podcast. If you haven't already, go ahead and click follow and subscribe so you don't miss any of our episodes. Because if I do say so myself, this is important content. Let's talk about survival. Not just in the wild, but in the mind. Michelle Dowd's story isn't just about escaping what she calls a strict apocalyptic survivalist cult. It's about dismantling the psychological walls that were built around her since the day she was born. She was raised in what has been called, quote, the field, a 16-acre wilderness compound built by her grandfather in Southern California. She says she learned discipline, forest survival, and lived under the weight of a belief system that dictated every thought, every move. Well, here's the twist. While she was being trained to survive the end of time, she was also sharpening something even more powerful, her mind. From the outside, she was just another member. But on the inside, she was collecting knowledge. She was questioning while she was adapting. And when the moment came, she didn't run. She outmaneuvered the world that had controlled her. Now she's the author of Forager, Field Notes on Surviving a Family Cult, a memoir of survival, identity, and finding her way beyond the world she was born into. She's been featured in the New York Times, The Guardian, Los Angeles Times, and more, all sharing her journey. Well, welcome, Michelle. I find this history really intriguing. Sorry that you went through it, but again, I'm so glad that you're using your experience to share this with others and to teach them the things that you learned. I guess I want to start out by asking you, you were in this from birth until you were 17, right?
Correct. I would also say that because my family started this and they've been there, I feel like it took me a lot longer than that to actually fully leave. Just want to throw that out there because I know a lot of people, when they get out, they think they should be done. And it's hard to really be done.
You did have a relationship with your mother after you left, correct? You still stayed in touch?
Yes.
Did you do that because you felt a connection to her or you felt a duty to do that? Because you mentioned that when you're born in what you call the field, which is what you describe clearly as a cult, that at birth, you're, I guess, surrendered to or assigned to, however you want to describe it, the collective. So rather than bonding directly with your parents, that you're raised by the group, the collective, and you don't have the connection that people normally would with their parents. Is that a fair way to describe that?
Yes, you described that very well. And the first part that you asked, no, I don't think it was because I had a connection with her. I think that I still felt very much like my responsibility to what I at that time thought of as God was in the cult. And my mom was very influential there. And I just needed, I think, to let her know sometimes that I was okay. And also, I think I was still trying to get a little bit of love or respect from her. When I say I was in touch, I mean, we weren't hanging out and I moved out of state and I felt like maybe there was no cell phones and internet and that kind of thing. It's like we weren't talking very often, but I would always make sure that she knew, and I had children young, so I made sure that she knew who her grandchildren were. I can't completely say why, except for that probably I felt still that maybe I would go to hell if I didn't please, to some degree, my family of origin.
This was started by your grandfather, is that correct?
Correct.
Can you describe to people what the defining mission was of this particular sect, cult, why it was started, what they believed, what the guiding principles were, so people get a feel for what defined this particular ideology?
I wouldn't say that I could entirely speak for my grandfather. Nothing was written down. He did everything charismatically, and he was very mercurial. But my understanding, and this part I know is historically accurate, that by 1931, they were being written up in the newspaper as a boys' organization that was going up to the mountains, which would later become where I was raised. And that he used to be a Boy Scout leader, that he left the Boy Scouts in order to have more influence over the boys that he led. And so from 1931 until sometime in the 1960s, it was really a all male organization, and no one was allowed to marry and nobody had children. So the men who were there were ostensibly, or at least theoretically, celibate, and they were just all men for decades. And then my mother was his fourth child, his first girl. And in the 1960s, he, I think, decided, since the world hadn't ended and he said it was going to end in the 1970s, that he needed to make sure she got married. And so he married her off to to his main lead man, who was my father. And I think my grandfather's ideology was that he was building the army of God. And he believed that God called him to be the next prophet, kind of like Muhammad or Elijah. He used to quote Elijah a lot, and he believed that he would be 500 years old and that he would lead in the army to fight in Armageddon.
How did they survive? You said that they lived off the land. You, in fact, were trained. This was a big part of it. You were trained on how to survive off the land, what plants were edible and not edible, and that sort of thing. Did any of these people work outside of this compound? Did they go away and work in town and come back? Did they buy things? How did they get by?
So there were many different iterations of this organization. When my parents didn't work outside at all, ever. But my parents were really central leaders. So the main, fellowship of this organization was boys mostly. And later there were some girls, like during my era, but it was children whose families basically wanted to hand their children over to this collective. I happened to have my parents there, but most people did not. And so their parents worked outside of the organization. The kids themselves only worked inside the organization. And the only way you could ever become a leader or fully vested in what they would never call a cult, but we'll call the organization, the only way you could be vested in the organization is to have been raised there since usually the age of 6 or 7, if you weren't born there, which a few of us were.
Certainly they didn't call themselves a cult. No cult ever calls themselves a cult. But how did they refer to themselves?
So there was a couple words. To outsiders, we called ourselves members. So we were members of the field. The field was the term that all the insiders used. Outside the organization, it was originally called Boys Christian League, but nobody referred to it as that. They called it BCL, but all the inside people never called it BCL. They always called it the field. And the boys who were at the field wanted to grow up to be in the army of God, and they wanted to be separate and different than their parents. Parents were vilified, but parents often contributed financially to this organization. It's kind of like sending your boys to a monastery or something, and you want to support the monastery, but you don't need to know what goes on inside of it. I'm not saying it's equal to that. I'm saying that it's similar in the sense that once you're inside, you're not allowed to tell your family what you're doing. In my case, my family was there, but everyone else who joined, it was like this, you answered to God, and God became, well, at least their version of God, right? Like their version of God became the central abiding principle, which really only my grandfather could interpret. So he would tell you what God was saying, and you would choose to believe it or you would get excommunicated.
I used to sleep terribly, but I found Beam's Dream Powder, a science-backed, healthy nighttime blend packed with ingredients shown to improve sleep. Beam is founded in America and run by people who share our values of hard work. Their Dream Powder is made with a powerful blend of all-natural ingredients: reishi, magnesium, L-theanine, apigenin, and melatonin. Here's the deal. Beam is giving my listeners the ultimate Patriot discount of up to 40% off. Try their best sleeping dream powder and get up to 40% off for a limited time. Go to shopbeam.com/Dr. Phil and use code Dr. Phil at checkout. That's shopbeam.com/Dr. Phil and use code Dr. Phil for up to 40% off. Sleep better, wake up stronger, and show up ready for your family, your work, and your country. Because when you're well rested, you're unstoppable. And this country needs more people like that. Did you have contact with the outside world in terms of newspapers, media, radio, television, anything like that?
For me, no, except for I was basically a peddler. I earned money by selling things at various points throughout my childhood, starting when I was very young. And I was also a little bit of a street performer. We collected donations and we traveled proselytizing from state to state. We stayed at a different place every night. I never gave anybody my real name. I mean, I was doing this before I was 1 year old. I didn't know a lot of this till my mom died, but when she had her baby, she gave them to the collective, but then we just toured around and usually I was all boys, and we were just kind of raised by these members. And since my book came out, I would say about 150 former members who cared for me in one way or another have contacted me and said, thank you so much. This has been so healing. Let me tell you a little bit about who you were as a baby. Or one gentleman has been talking to me quite a bit. He knew my parents and my grandparents really well. He didn't know when I was born, but he still feels like he wants to be a father figure to me, but he still feels like he's very, very much impacted by my family, even though he didn't know me directly. And he said for himself and his wife, this conversation has been so healing. So I guess I'm trying to say that I think that people had really different experiences inside the cults. And there's a huge range of why they were there, how long they stayed. The people who've stayed there their whole entire lives, of course, would tell you a completely different story than I'm telling you, because they have chosen to believe that they're still going to be the army of God as the world ends.
This was a 16-acre plot near the Angeles National Forest in Southern California. How far did you range when you guys went out? And you said you never stayed in the same place. You kept on the move. You were performing, peddling, things like that. How far did you roam?
All the way to the East Coast all the time. We went to Washington, D.C. to try to influence the government. We went to Mexico quite a bit, slept on the dirt, went to fishing villages. We went to Canada. So we were crossing the borders. That's the only two countries that we crossed during the time I was doing that. I also want to make clear that my nuclear family was the only ones who lived on the 16-acre compound. There was another place that was actually, so we called that the mountain. And my grandfather had leased that as a spiritual retreat, but not everybody lived there. It was just, we lived there. That's the only home I had, but I wasn't always there. And everybody else either lived when they were little kids with their families, or they stayed at the field, which was basically a cleared out dump on the border of El Monte in Southern California.
Oh, wow. So the 16-acre plot, who actually lived there? And was it forest? Was it just a field? What was actually there?
So the 16-acre plot was and is, it's still there. It is government land, actually, that my grandfather leased in 1947. He got it for super cheap, I think something like $100 a year. And I think they still have a contract that's similar. The government leased out a lot of that national land after World War II to help organizations. I mean, a lot of them are religious organizations, but to have young people have access to the mountains. And the only people who actually lived there full time was my mother, my father, my three siblings. And we usually had two men who were leaders in the organization, usually in their early 20s, who were doing a lot of the physical labor that needed to transpire. And then a bus would come up, sometimes two buses of young people, whoever they were trying to sort of indoctrinate. And they would come and stay generally for 3 days or a week or 2 weeks and learn about God outside of their family. So it was like just kids who came up, if that makes sense.
Uh-huh.
It's hard to explain. And so when I chose to write Forager the way that I did, I wrote it from the perspective of what I saw as a child. There's a lot of things I didn't see that I've learned since the book came out.
Really?
Which I think is really interesting. Yeah, because I mean, I was a child and I was told a lot of things that weren't true.
What was the biggest thing that you've learned since the book came out? What was the main thing you were enlightened about since the book came out? Because you said a lot of people contacted you and started filling in the blanks.
I think the main thing that I learned, or at least the thing I believe, is that my mother was, which I guess I always knew, but she was raised in this space, and that I always thought she didn't love me. She never could say she loved me. She didn't hug me. I felt very abandoned by her. But I think since the book came out, I have seen that my mother was a victim, just like I was, that she was just as much of a victim as I was. But because she didn't leave, she never learned how to attach. And that she believed that giving her children up was like the biggest ask that God required of her. And I never knew that was difficult on her. Like I just thought she didn't care. And I think the thing that I learned is she did care, and that not that she was necessarily looking out for us, but she believed really deeply that we would be cared for in the bigger picture by God. And she always quoted the Abraham and Isaac story, the story that Abraham was told by God that he had to sacrifice his only son, and that because he was willing to do that, in his case, God stayed the hand of the angel, but Abraham was willing to kill his own son to prove his allegiance to God. And my mom believed that she was asked to do that. I don't know that I hated her because I was there with her during her whole death and loved her, but I think I resented that. I felt very abandoned. And talking to all these early caregivers of mine, I mean, there were so many that they would take care of me for a day, a week, whatever. But I feel like, oh, she was a human woman who did a really hard thing because her father, who was probably mentally ill, required it of her.
You were taught a lot of things, and a lot of things were also done to you. But if we, right now today, if somebody snapped you up and parachuted you into a giant forest somewhere, you would be particularly equipped to survive. Fair statement?
Yes. Kind of like, what was the show called Alone? I've had so many people say, like, you should go on that show. I don't even know if they still film it. But yeah, I mean, I would be more equipped than the average person by far. Sure.
What would you be able to do? How would you survive? You know what to eat, not eat, how to find, what would you do? What do you know that other people don't know?
I'm sure some people know this, but the average person, I would say, would panic. And the number one thing that I would be able to do, and I know this is true, I mean, I just feel like I have to close my eyes just to like show you that it would be like, I would completely sit and feel what it's around me. And I would start breathing with the forest. I would start seeing the forest as my friend rather than an enemy. I would not try to survive the forest. I would try to befriend the forest and ask what I could do or learn or see to be provided for. I think the biggest things in survival situations is when you panic or you think you have to go and make something happen, you don't sometimes see the I guess supplies, like the literal access that you have to nourishment. So I would also do something my mom taught us to do, which is in her language, survive fear, survive with faith. So the first thing I would do is seek shelter, like just in pragmatic terms. And I would not panic. And then I would look for what I am a place for shelter. So just like real estate, it's location, 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 like where you put your shelter is the most important thing. So if you're not panicking, you give yourself an hour to sort of look around. I wouldn't go too far from where I landed because I would think that it's possible someone would come back to rescue me. But I would look for high ground that's not an animal trail. I would be near water, but not on water. If I could find it, I would go through all that. And then next, try to figure out warmth, because unless you're smack in the middle of the summer, and even then sometimes, if you can't keep yourself warm at night, hypothermia is like the first thing that's going to take you out. So I would work on fire, and then I would think about signaling if I wanted to be rescued. And if I was in hiding, I would very clearly remove all aspects of signaling. And I know very well how to do that either way. And then I would look for a water source if I hadn't already found one in relation to shelter. And then, and only then, after I'd done all that, and probably not until the next day, would I start to look at food sources. And I would start with plant resources. You have a lot better chance of not having issues with the environment around you if you know how to eat the plants. I'm not saying I would never eat. I would fish if that was available, but I probably would not start by killing animals at all. I don't think that would be for the best food source in the long run. Quite honestly, you can exhaust yourself trying to figure out how to chase creatures.
Yeah. And you know what to eat and what not to eat.
Yes, I know way more than the average person, but it is regional, I would know how to survive in the Angeles National Forest. And I am currently spending a lot of time in the San Bernardino Mountains, and I'm learning a lot about that. So I would know how to survive there too. If I was dropped somewhere I didn't know, I know how to at least a little bit understand toxicity in terms of smell. I know how to taste something and wait. Like if I didn't know what a plant was, I could wait. There's certain things I wouldn't mess with, like certain mushrooms if I didn't know, because if you eat the wrong mushroom, you can die. Most other plants, it's only if you eat too much that you could die. So if I didn't really know a plant, I would know some identifying characteristics that would be likely to be beneficial versus toxic. And then I would take them in super, super small doses and keep track. Like I know how to do this in the dirt. Like if I didn't have any paper, I know how to mark things, and you'd put the actual plant and you would put you'd mark the little, you can do kind of from the sun angles, like you would know what time that you took it, and you would wait 12 hours, because if you didn't have any reaction in 12 hours, then you could eat more of that. And I would keep track of all that. And I don't know if you ever heard the story of Chris McCandless, who John Krakauer did a wonderful job writing about his story. Chris died in Alaska from eating berries, most likely. Starvation he died of, but he also created he was throwing up and having diarrhea and stuff, so he became dehydrated. And the problem is, it's better to be hungry for a month than it is to eat something that is going to dehydrate you or cause you to lose nutrients by vomiting. So you have to be really careful about that. And I think I would have the patience, and this is something a lot of people wouldn't know how to do. I don't know if you would know how to do this, but to not just say, I need to eat, but say, no, not eating is the least of my problems right now. I need to find out what is safe for me here and learn to be in relationship with it. And then, if you know what's safe, you can continue to eat, which is much more important.
Yeah. And you have to have water. How do you know if water is safe to drink?
Well, running water usually is. And what's not safe is if you're around humans. So if you're around humans, you would probably just walk to the humans. But you would look for a water source that was running water. If you don't have running water, you're going to have to distill it. People hike with systems where they put in pills or something. If you had all that, you would obviously, clean your water. The deeper you dig down into the earth, the cleaner the water is. So it's not going to be defiled if you can manage to find a water source, also called a water table. So maybe if you go down a foot, even. So sometimes, I don't know if you know, when people are building, they do vertical wells in places that don't have a lot of water and horizontal wells in places that are water rich. So if you were in a place where you could basically do a horizontal well, you wouldn't have to go down that far, and you would kind of just clear out the water table. And in a sense, you're making a pond. And the deeper you go down into that, the better choice you have of it not being hostile to you. That being said, most water sources that kill you in foreign countries and things have to do with the microbes and the things that are related to the human population that has defiled it.
Well, you definitely are discussing things that I think the average person at the mall doesn't know.
Yeah, I haven't talked to a whole lot of people at malls, so probably you're right.
Whether it's talk of a Nobel Peace Prize or fears of World War III, one thing's certain: uncertainty rules the day. And when the world feels this unstable, your finances are on the line. If Iran blocks the Strait of Hormuz, oil prices could skyrocket just like the 1970s. That triggered inflation, gas shortages, and a weakening dollar. Wall Street's already tense. Goldman Sachs sees sustained recession risk, and JP Morgan warns of a potential oil shock. Add in $36 trillion in national debt, and the financial pressure is real. This isn't hype, it's a wake-up call. The time to act is now. That's why I trust Preserve Gold. When the world turns unstable, smart folks turn to gold and silver. Text Dr. Phil to 50505 to get your free precious metals guide from Preserve Gold. As a bonus, you can get up to $15,000 in free silver with a qualified purchase. So don't wait. Text Dr. Phil to 50505 today. I talk to people sometimes with, kids that they've been raised by members of the KKK or some extreme group or whatever, and they say, my God, how can those kids have such hate, and how can they say the things they say? And I always remind people, if that's all they've ever known, if that's all they've ever heard, people write on the slate of who those children are. And if the only people that have ever written on that slate write hate and write the things that they write on the slate of who those children are, they have nothing to compare it to. They have no idea that that is toxic. And you were in a situation like that, and you were programmed very much to prepare for the end of times, and raised by a collective and not had the kind of bonding that people typically have, relationship formation that people typically have. But you started to think your way out of that. How do you explain that you found a way to start to question what was being written on the slate of who you are? What was your reference point, and how did you start to question?
It's a beautiful question. You did a wonderful job setting that up. First of all, thank you for acknowledging that children who are raised in situations, they are no way responsible as children for what they believe. We are all raised in cultures. And even Catholics will say, give me a child to the age of 5 and I'll give you a Catholic for life. There's a lot of stuff that goes into early programming that it's really hard to undo. So in my case, I think maybe 3 things. First, because I was the fourth child born into this organization, but I was the second in my biological family. And so at the very beginning of this, they didn't know how to educate us because they had never raised children. And they sent us to public school at the very beginning. My older sister went to school for 4 years. I went to school for 3 years. My little sister went to school for 1 year. And I think that public school really gave me a foundation. I was a quick learner. I learned to read in kindergarten. And so I got to go all the way through second grade. And in the book Forager, I discussed that for whatever reason, I was put in this gifted program. And so I was given some tools in first and second grade. So like a 6 and 7-year-old map making, for example, I don't know if this was a very specific teacher who cared about this, but this particular teacher taught us how to map the area of the school and then to think about mapping where we live by the proximity of what's important in our community. And he had no idea I was raised in a cult. We were taught not to talk about anything about where we came from. But I learned to think specifically spatially and to think about how this school existed outside. So I think it was a huge deal. We moved up to the mountain just at the end of when I was 7, like right before I turned 8. And then I didn't have any of this kind of thing again. But that really early childhood education, just in a regular public school in El Monte School District, and they stopped doing that, like obviously, because you can learn all sorts of coping mechanisms that aren't helpful in a cult. But that was super influential to me, I'm sure. I also think that some of the caregivers that I had were very young. A lot of them were 12 or 13. I've been going to lunch a lot with a woman who she left at age 15. Her parents pulled her out because they realized it was really unhealthy for her. And she has been impacted by this her whole life. And she's, I don't know, maybe 12 or 13 years older than me, or maybe 11 years older, but she used to take care of me when I was a baby when she was probably 12. And I think, she's told me, she said, but I held you and I wasn't there very much, but I did hold you when I was there. And I loved you as much as a 12-year-old can. And I think that there were girls, but I think mainly, I don't really know. There was probably a lot of men who took care of me. My mom didn't want the girls taking care of us, the ones who would come in. But this woman she has filled in so many blanks for me. And it made me think, like she said, but there were those of us who would come in and we would look at you. And I think like just having that eye contact with a compassionate, honestly, a child, really. She was a child, but like she might have been kind of like an older sister who just came and went. I think there were huge attachment issues because I remembered her. I think I was 4 when she got pulled out. And I was devastated that she left. Like when she started coming to my readings, she came to several events before she introduced herself. Of course, I wouldn't have recognized her because I was a really young child. But by the time she talked to me, I remembered her name and she still had a birth name. And I started crying. I was just so moved that this woman who I hadn't seen since I was 4 was like standing in front of me and caring about me still. So I think that was a huge, huge asset. And then the other thing is I got an autoimmune disease, or at least it was diagnosed when I was 10. I'm sure I had it before that. That was probably a way of my body fighting back from some of the sexual abuse and other things that had happened to me. And because I was so sick, because long story that I tell in Forager, I ended up in Children's Hospital in Los Angeles. And I think I didn't know how to tell anybody the truth, but I was. And I think in that era too, I don't think that they were asking those kind of questions. I've talked to some nurses who worked in the hospitals in those eras, and there just wasn't the kind of awareness there is now. But I think I was aware that other families were able to care for their children in ways that my family wasn't. While I wasn't willing to talk about that, I think I was willing to watch and say, oh, there's something wrong with where I come from. And of course, I blamed myself and thought I was unlovable, but I still understood that love existed.
You said once you hit your teenage years, you said you started to question the contradictions and the hypocrisies that you observed because this was supposedly such a godly thing, but yet you were abused. You were physically abused, sexually abused, neglected. You said you recorded those doubts in the only secular book that you had, which was a Sears catalog, which is an interesting use for a Sears catalog. What kind of things were you writing down? And this is a form of journaling, obviously. And did you go back to that and look at it on a regular basis? Because that's a fascinating way to start creating a history. And I've always said, thinking about things, that's one level of analysis, but to write them down creates objectivity. So you can go back and look at it a week later, a month later, 3 months later, and it creates some concreteness and some objectivity that grounds it for you. That's so important to do, and it's amazing to me that you had the insight to do that at that young age. I'd love to hear more about what you were writing down and what kind of clarity that created for you.
When I was 7, there was a fire in the camper that we were living in or staying in and when we were traveling around proselytizing. And we didn't have a home at that point. Our nuclear family had lost our home. And so our dog died in the fire, and every single belonging I had in the world disappeared in that fire. And we went up to the mountain, and my dad's mom, who lived on the East Coast and she was not involved in the cult, sent us something from the Sears catalog to pick up so that we would have something to wear because we had no clothes. And the woman at I guess it was a round building that was, I guess, where you'd go and pick up things from Sears. We picked up our clothes and she gave me the catalog, and I hid it because I knew my family wouldn't want me to have it. And I hid it in the mountains. So I wasn't reading it regularly because I had to sneak away to get access to the Sears catalog. But I did know how to write because I'd been to school before that, and I didn't go back to school at that point. They did educate us in the organization down at the field, but that's a little more complicated because it wasn't like education in the way that you think of education. But in any case, I wrote down things from the Bible because that is the one book that I had access to. And my grandfather, who was this really fire and brimstone preacher, I don't even know if he was reading the Bible. Like, I really don't. I sometimes question if he even knew how to read, but he was quoting things from his head or something. I'm sure he was very intelligent, but that I didn't think were true, and I couldn't find them in the Bible. So I'd use my dad's Bible and then my mom's Bible. And so when I turned 8, I promised myself I would read every word of the Bible before I turned 9. And so I would borrow my parents' Bibles, and we had the King James version. So that's kind of a complicated, language, a Shakespearean language, or like what we would call Shakespearean language from the same era. And I read the entire Bible, cover to cover, word for word. And I started marking anything that seemed like a contradiction between what was written in the Bible and what I was hearing my grandfather speak. And we had to listen to my grandfather all the time. Like, he preached every day. Like, we had to just constantly hear him. And so I just started noticing the contradictions, and I would ask my mom and she would deny them, or now we might call it gaslighting, but I think she was so indoctrinated, she didn't know, she was just like, she just told me to be quiet and not to ask those questions. And I felt like everyone I asked in the organization told me I was wrong. And so I just stopped talking. I feel like I maybe in fact, all the people who come back and tell me, like, you were so quiet, we didn't even know you had a voice. Like, I think I stopped talking probably when I was 8. I don't think I really spoke much between 8 and then probably 13. And so I wrote everything down in the book. And then when my grandfather gave me a copy of the Bible, which is really beautiful that he gave me that, I started writing in the Bible itself. And they would have considered that sacrilege. So I didn't tell them I wrote in the Bible, but I started making notes of stories in the Bible that contradicted other versions of story in the Bible. And I guess I started thinking at a very young age, for sure by the time I was 9, that there's such a thing as perspective, and that assuming, because I thought it was all the word of God, assuming that it's the word of God, I was like, oh, but humans are the one telling the stories, and humans see this from different perspectives. And then I started noticing everyone around me and started thinking about how they're telling a story from a different perspective. So I think I became really aware of storytelling by the time, probably easily by the time I was 10. And then I started trying to create a narrative that could end differently for me than the one I was told was my fate.
When your camper burned and you lost everything, that was obviously a very stressful thing for you, right? Because you lost everything. And listening to your grandfather preach constantly and say things that weren't truing up for you, that created a lot of stress within you, a lot of cognitive dissonance if you couldn't square it up. The whole time we've been talking, those two things that you talked about, you still show real stress indicators for those two things. Your blink rate went up 10x when you talked about those two things while we're talking here. Those had to be really traumatic experiences for you during that time. You were doing really critical thinking at a very young age. If your grandfather is saying things that you're saying, I can't find this anywhere in the Bible, you're the only person I know that's read the Bible cover to cover by age 9. I've read it cover to cover, but it damn sure wasn't by age 9, I can tell you that. What did you say to yourself at that age when you thought, okay, he's preaching this, but it is not in the Bible? What did you say to yourself at age 9?
I thought I was wrong.
Really? You thought you were wrong?
Of course. Of course.
Because he's a power figure.
Well, he's a power figure, but I thought he was God's chosen person and I was nobody. And when you talk about like the stress, no one's ever told me that I express stress when I tell that, but it wasn't the things. We really didn't have very many things, but I love that dog so much. And when our dog burned up, I said to my mom, later, I was like, what happened? Like, does the dog go to heaven? Like, what, And she's like, it's just a dog. Like, what, like it was so dismissed as nothing for the dog to burn up. And it was one of the only loving attachments that I had as a child. And it wasn't the dog we'd had very long. Our dogs came and went. They were all mutts and from the street, but it was something that her name was Duchess, and I just loved her so much. So I think that I just thought I was accused of like being soft. I think not just because of the dog, but all of it. So I just thought there was something wrong with me all the time. And my desire to figure it out wasn't to prove him wrong. It was to figure out why I was wrong, like where I was wrong, so that I could become a better godly person. And when I got sick, my grandfather said it was because I wasn't a believer, and it was like God was punishing me. And I'm sure he told my mom. I don't know. My mom didn't talk about it. And my siblings never came to the hospital. They were like completely left in the dark about it. But it was like, she's a bad person. And I was 10 years old. So of course I thought that like he knew what he was talking about and I didn't. And so I needed to figure it out so I could get on board.
Do you realize now fully, or do you still wrestle with the fact of what a terrible and abusive thing that is to blame the child at that time? I mean, that dog was probably your primary connection. That was probably your primary relationship. When it sounds strange to say that you probably had more love, connection, and affection for that animal than the humans in your life at the time. But that probably was your primary connection and relationship at that time, because the dog accepted you and let you love the dog. It let you love on it and loved you back. And then you're mocked for feeling a grieving and feeling a sense of loss about it. You're blamed for that. You get sick, you're blamed for that. I know now, logically, you can look back and say, I suspect what a terrible thing that is to put on a child. Is there still a part of you that plays tug of war with that, or do you clearly 100% see how abusive that is?
100% see how abusive that is, but my feelings are still in tug of war. I think my siblings and it was so painful. We couldn't there were so many aspects of that experience that we were separated from each other and we couldn't talk about. And to this day, there's just so much emotion. When this book first came out, I hadn't given it to my siblings. I told them about it, but I hadn't given it to them. Anyway, my brother ordered a copy and his Amazon copy came early and he read it and he drove from Santa Barbara to my house the day the book came out. So like he was there in the morning and he said, I never knew I had feelings like about this. Like I just know I've like spent my whole life. I went to a party where I was introduced to a bunch of his friends who had become his chosen family. And they said, we didn't even know he had a sister. Like he never talked about his past. And he just said, like, the emotional truth of this is my story. Like, even though I would have said that my brother was raised differently than I was because we are often not together, but he was just like, this is like the first time I've thought of myself as being wounded by what happened to us. Like he also said, I just thought I was a bad kid. So yes, I'm 100% sure, especially talking to my brother as an adult who's also had huge attachment issues. I feel like yes, it was the most abusive thing, but like if you live your whole life focused on what happened to you, it's just really hard to move on. And it's hard to accept love if you're like focused on what was taken from you.
The tool of the cult is they have to blunt any other relationship because it's a threat to their primacy, to their omnipotence. Because anything, if you're allowed to bond with your parents, if you're allowed to bond with a pet, even intellectually with a philosopher or another mindset, that's a threat to the cult leadership. So they have to blunt all of that, right? If you are able to build self-worth, if you're able to build a self-image, that's a threat to their control and their omnipotence. So they have to create complete dependency and undermine everything else with self-doubt. So that's why they have to do that. And they understand that really early on, because any independence, any critical thinking, any self-thought is a threat to their control. So that's why they instill that in you, your brother, everybody else, because there's only one place to look, which it's really interesting because the Bible is, there's no other God and there no false idols, and they immediately violate the fundamental principle of God by putting themselves in between. It's like you say, it's a complete hypocrisy and contradiction, but yet that's what they embrace. And if it still infiltrates you, there's a long tail on the effect that it has on the people that they damage early on. And you see it in your brother and you see it in you as well. You have spent a lot of time teaching young people to think critically. Why is that so important to you?
I feel like it's evident probably, but I used to tell the students all the time, don't ever believe what I say. You can learn from what I say. Like, I'm going to give you some tools, but go verify it. And if I make a mistake in class, like later when people had cell phones, I would say, fact check me like right now and just correct me. Just tell me, hey, this, or, you do it respectfully, but say like, hey, this doesn't sound true. Maybe I made a mistake. Maybe I said it wrong because I was talking too fast or whatever. Like, I want to know if I made a mistake. And then I would tell them that when anybody tells you something, you need to find out how to verify it. And you need to verify it from more than one source because everyone is biased. I used to teach critical thinking across the curriculum to faculty members as well. And in fact, I taught some survival skills as critical thinking too, because there's a lot of things that we as humans are prone to when it comes to fear. And one of the things we can do when we are aware of our fear is learn techniques for calming ourselves down so we can think more critically. I think that teaching critical thinking, like learning all the just the logical fallacies, like some of them were like kind of like not silly, but fun, like post hoc ergo propter hoc, or like, I don't know, false dichotomies, but just to recognize them. We used to look at works of journalism and point out, I would have them find the logical fallacies in the stories that they were reading. And I said, if you can do that, like you don't have to judge the person who wrote it because sometimes they're telling the truth the best they can, but you can't take things as true just because someone says them. I don't care how important that person is. And I think that spending years teaching it really helped me understand that what an incredible tool that I was given, I think, from the map making when I was a really little kid in school, but to be able to apply it to scripture, to do, to basically create my own sense of concordance and cross referencing, like that was a survival tool as well. And so I don't think that surviving in the mountains is that useful for the average human in today's culture. Certainly, Americans don't really have a lot of need for that, but the survival tool, critical thinking, is something that we need more than ever. Media literacy, all of it. And so, to be able to bring that skill into real world practical application for young people was just, like an obvious choice, I think, for me.
Oh, I think surviving in the mountains is about as close of a direct analogy to what people need to do in everyday life as you could possibly get. I mean, when I asked you about it and said, if we dropped you in the forest, what would you do? You said, well, the first thing I would do is not panic. How could anything be more relevant to urban life or corporate life? That would be the first rule you would tell people. This is crisis management 101. It doesn't matter if you're in the woods or you're in corporate America or you're in an urban situation where they dropped you in a back alley at midnight in Shanghai. I'm so glad that you can share that information with people. And when you're talking about critical thinking, I mean, I don't know if you know, but I've been very outspoken about the fact that one of the biggest problems we have in our colleges and universities today is we're not teaching critical thinking. I mean, when I look on the campus of Harvard or Columbia and I see people, these students walking along with a 12-foot banner that says Gays for Gaza, I'm thinking, you're not critically thinking, people. Walk that across the line into the Gaza Strip and see how far you get. They kill you within 6 feet. What are you talking about? We've got to teach these people to think critically again. And you say you encourage your students to take risk. How do you talk to them about the attacks that they get if they challenge the controlling narrative in this era of cancel culture?
You need a whole episode on that. I feel like that is such a big question. I've told my students for years, this is not a safe space. I'm not claiming we have a safe space in this conversation. I want it to be a brave space. And we are very fortunate that we are unlikely to be physically harmed in the course of this conversation, but you may be triggered. And one of the greatest gifts you can have in the world is learn how to manage your triggers. We had a young person who, I don't know exactly, it was very complicated how he was raised, but he would wear a Nazi outfit to class. And I just didn't consider it my responsibility to teach him about the political history. I mean, I assumed that he'd been told that his whole life that he was inappropriate. But the thing is, I still met him where he was at. And by the end, he took 2 different semesters with me and he stopped wearing that on his own. I mean, he did a lot of things, but his mother was schizophrenic. I think he thought he was protecting himself from her. There was just a lot of complicated stuff that I can't get into because it's his story. But by the end, he said, I was taught to disrespect. He used that word, disrespect women. And I didn't think that I could learn anything from you. And he said, I think I tried to intimidate you. And he said, thank you for not being intimidated. And he shook my hand and he said, I've learned so much about myself. And I think that sometimes when we cancel people who do things that are absurd, or we think that they're absurd, we could critically think that they're absurd. We don't know where they came from. And you mentioned right at the beginning of people who are raised in the Ku Klux Klan, like those young people are going to believe things that are, and maybe they're not being raised in that now, but there's people who are being raised with horrible belief systems. And if we don't create a space, a brave space for them to bring out what they believe, how are they going to ever have a conversation about like how they learned that? I mean, like if they can't talk about it, they're probably not going to be convinced that they were wrong or that they are wrong or that their family's wrong. I mean, they have an emotional identification with it. So to me, counseling people for making mistakes defeats the purpose of education. We like we all make mistakes, and to be brave enough to come and make a mistake in front of people who are going to tell you you're wrong, like what greater courage is that? That's how we learn from our mistakes.
If I see someone that is angry, I mean, even if something as trivial as you're checking out at the grocery store and the the cashier is rude and terse and clearly angry, and you know that it can't be you because you just got there and they were already pissed off when you showed up. I always try to tell people that anger is just an outward expression of hurt, fear, or frustration, or maybe all three. And if you look past the outward manifestation, and if you can describe them without using that word in a sentence, instead of saying, boy, that person was really angry, and instead look past it and say, that person was really hurt, or that person was really scared, or that person was really frustrated, instead of that person was really angry. If you substitute hurt, fear, or frustration in your sentence when you're describing them, then you engage at a completely different level, right? Instead of saying, boy, that person was really pissed off, you say, that person was really in pain, or that person was really scared or frustrated. Then you don't put your dukes up to fight. Instead, you start seeing that person is in need in some way. But we don't do that in such a divisive culture that we're in today. If you just look past the outward manifestation, you'll find there's some humanity there that you can deal with. We just don't do that much anymore because we deal with topics and ignore issues. The topic is what maybe they're barking about, but what's the issue that's making them bark about the topic? Because usually the topic has nothing to do with what's really going on. And I hate it when I sound like a shrink, but that's where critical thinking comes in, where you have to start thinking about what's really motivating what's happening right now. And you seem to be getting to that when you're encouraging people to ask questions. Someone smarter than me said, I'd rather have questions I can't answer than answers I can't question. Because if we get to the point that we have answers we can't question, we've really shut down critical thinking. We've really shut down learning, and we're totally in a bubble at that point. And you're challenging your students to question you, to question themselves. And if we can prove ourselves wrong, now we're really taking giant leaps forward.
Well, what you described is exactly what a cult does, right? It's answers you can't question.
Exactly. There's no room.
And so, in a sense, I've spent my whole life dismantling like what hurt me, in a sense. Like our wounds are light. It's the things that I still feel pain about are the things I feel so committed to changing, or to at least giving people the opportunity to not repeat in the next generation. Or, I mean, obviously I can't change the world. Like I can't fix it all, but I can work with individual people who perhaps then would not repeat those mistakes that were done to me and done to many, many, many others as well. I'm not alone in this.
Do you guys talk about confirmation bias when you're discussing critical thinking?
100%. Yeah. I have students take a test at the beginning, and I'm not going to give the resource right now, but I say we all have biases, and if you don't understand your biases, then you are for sure going to participate in confirmation bias. But I mean, confirmation bias is real. It is a fact. And when we understand our own biases, and we can't just get rid of them because we see them, we have to work with them. Then we understand that we want to get a certain answer. And so that's all we see is that particular path. And it takes a lot of time to dismantle that in each of us, myself included. Like I have to over and over say to myself, oh, is that what I'm expecting to get? Maybe I can dial it back a moment and see what's really happening here.
Yeah, and that's one of the toughest things, because it's like trying to look at your own face without a mirror. We're not that fast. That's really hard to do, but if we can get people to really, that's why I love the fact that you were writing things in a Sears catalog, because that's like creating a mirror. You can write it down and come back to it a week later, 2 weeks later, and say, this is what I was thinking. I may not be thinking it today, but that's what I was spontaneously thinking at the time. That gives you that objectivity from it, which is great. To do that at such a young age is really amazing. And I love that you're continuing to teach and share that. Your book is Forager, Field Notes for Surviving a Family Cult. And this isn't theory. This is a memoir. And I have to say, it's a really insightful memoir. And I think this is an ongoing journey with you. I suspect there's going to be a second book, a part two, a revised version. You strike me as someone that's on a journey of self-discovery, rediscovery. I, for one, think it's courageous and very fascinating. And I recommend that everybody buy 2 copies of this book, because you're going to read it and then you're going to want to share it with somebody you really love and care about, but you're not going to want to give them your copy. So you're going to want to have another copy so you can give it to somebody that you love and care about. So I highly recommend this book because it was written with candor and courage, and I think everybody should read this book because it will stimulate your thinking and the way you look at how you were programmed. Maybe not as dramatically as this, but we all have had experiences that dictate who we are. I talk about the fact that we encountered 10 defining moments, make 7 critical choices, and encounter 5 pivotal people. I'll bet you could fill that 10-7-5 out very effectively. And I think everybody can, but you've written something meaningful here. I hope you're really proud of it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'd like to add to that the Sears catalog, I still have that. And one of the guys who lived with us was a woodworker because he built the things at the camp that we lived at. And he built box for me and he gave me a lock, and no one had ever given me a special, and he didn't know, I think I had it, or maybe he did know and he didn't acknowledge it. I don't know. But he gave me a box and I'd put the lock on, and I lost the key back when I was 17 or whatever. Dr. Phil, I had not opened that box until I wrote a piece for the New York Times that I had agents calling me and they're like, write a book or whatever. I sold the book without opening the box. And then I, banged open, got the lock broken. I found the Sears catalog, found all this early writing. And then I channeled who I was as a child at the beginning of the book so that the book matures as I mature. And I wrote it in the dark by candlelight, by hand, the way I had written in the Sears catalog as a child. And it really brought back for me the child's awareness of just the beauty of trying to figure things out, and also the pain, of course, of being abandoned. And so it's so wonderful that you bring that up, just that the idea of these pivotal moments, and I found those pivotal moments in the process of writing this.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's why it's so authentic, because you went to those steps to do it. And congratulations on it. I'm sorry you went through it, but I'm also celebrating that you have turned it into a powerful tool for others to benefit from. If you just go through it and suffer it, it's penalty. If you use it to impact others, then all of those experiences became tuition. The tuition was way too high, it was way too expensive, but at least it was tuition instead of just penalty. And you've turned it into something that impacts others. So at least it was not just penalty. So God bless you for doing it. Well done. And I look forward to meeting you in person and talking to you again.
Thank you so much. This has been a very meaningful conversation for me. I appreciate you.
Same here. I look forward to seeing you in the future, and best of luck to you. We'll talk soon. Thank you so much.